Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our 33rd conversation for SEGRA for this year. For those who don't know you, my name is Kate Charters, and I'm the chair of SEGRA, the National Steering Committee, and SEGRA is the acronym for Sustainable Economic Growth for Regional Australia. SEGRA is recognised as Australia's most credible independent voice on issues affecting regional Australia. Established 24 years ago, it was set up to ensure that issues affecting regional, rural and remote Australia were given a voice. SEGRA aims to encourage networking, sharing of ideas, success stories, policy proposals amongst regional economic developers, community developers, government, elected officials, private and not-for-profit sectors, and researchers. And we, unfortunately, with COVID, were unable to hold our annual conference, which is an important networking and information exchange opportunity. But I'm pleased to let you know that we will be having our next conference on the 16th, 17th, and 18th of November in Kalgoorlie, the city of Kalgoorlie, Boulder. And if you hop on our website, there's a great video that outlines the economic development strategy for that region. So that's worth a look. Before I welcome you, our speaker for today, I'd just like to run over some housekeeping. Because of the nature of the webinar, we're unable to have direct speaking from registrants, but can I please encourage you to use the Q&A button or the chat box to participate, and I'll try and get to as many people's questions as I can. The webinars are all recorded and are available on the SEGRA website, www.segra.com.au, and they are also available on the SEGRA YouTube channel. So I encourage you to go back and look at some of the others that we've had, and a real mixture of policy ideas, new initiatives, demonstration projects are available there. I'd now like to warmly welcome Professor Alex Hannant, who's the co-director of the Yunus Centre at Griffith University. The Yunus Centre leads the university's applied research, education and engagement in the field of impact innovation, entrepreneurship and economy. And I met Alex at a conference in Mackay, and he's also involved in sustainable business development. So very interesting. Alex has a background in strategy, capability building, partnership brokering and innovation. He has broad international experience working in a range of fields, including poverty alleviation, sustainability, climate change, social enterprise, and impact investment. Previously based in the UK, Alex was the Director of Programs at Lead International, a global leadership network focused on sustainable development, and was also Head of Partnerships at the Climate and Development Knowledge Network. Later, as founding CEO of the Akina Foundation in New Zealand, Alex led a team that provided development support to more than 1,500 businesses and became the government's strategic partner on social enterprise development. He was also one of the founding members of New Zealand's National Advisory Board on Impact Investment. And Alex currently serves on the board of BLAB Australia and New Zealand. So look, we're delighted to have you here, Alex, and delighted to have your range of national and local, international and local experience for our delegates today. So in this seminar, Alex is going to be looking at what better could mean in the context of social and economic recovery and the ways of working that can turn challenging times into an opportunity. So welcome, Alex.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. And hello to everyone out there. And we were just talking before we went live about it's getting the end of a long year. So in many ways, what I want to do today is really, look back in terms of, what's happened and the implications of COVID for how we can rethink about recovery, not just getting back to where we were, but recognizing we actually have to move forward in a sort of very much a changed world, and not just by COVID. So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land. Where I'm beaming in from is Yarraga and Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So as I said, I mean, one of the things which has sort of triggered this investigation is a lot of this kind of rhetoric around build back better. And what we've been interested in is, well, what does actually better mean, and for whom, better for whom? And then if better is available to us, how do we actually get there? So it's a case of sort of rethinking about what we want from economic development going forward, and also thinking about the ways of working and how we direct innovation to get to that idea of better. What I'm going to run through is a short section of just taking stock, and not a sort of blow-by-blow account of COVID. It's really just trying to sort of surface some of the key implications. Then have a look at some stories of better, what could actually better look like. And it's important to recognise that a lot of this isn't new. A lot of the ideas or practices, approaches which represent what better could look like already exist, and in many cases it's a question of like, how do we scale and mainstream those approaches? And then last of all, we'll actually discuss and have a look at how we might actually do that. So taking stock, I think the first thing I just wanted to say is, look, the experience of COVID has been really different for everyone, within countries, between countries. And obviously with the announcement of the vaccines over the last few weeks, I think there's a sense of we are coming to towards the end game. And in Australia, with the borders opening today, it's another indicator of that. But while saying that, it's also important to recognise this is not over. And if we look at the number of cases around the world, that it's still actually going up. So obviously, those increases are concentrated in specific countries. But we, while we may be sort of feeling fatigue and have some good reason for optimism, this is something which is continuing. So I think it's just important to note that we're still very much sort of in this global shock. In Australia, the implications we've seen already, we have had about 30,000 cases. Tragically, just over 900 people have lost their lives. And economically, there's a big impact which has taken place. So Victoria, which is the state that been most heavily impacted, job losses over 400,000, a national unemployment rate of 13%, and indicators that sort of oversubscription from job seekers for new level entry positions. I think it's interesting to note that a lot of the superannuation funds have been hollowed out. So more than 500,000 people have completely cleaned out their future savings and retirements. So that is a really long-term impact. And some projections that GDP this year will fall about 7%. In terms of public debt, looking ahead from this year's budget, with the indication we're creeping up to $1 trillion of public debt by 2024. So we're looking ahead at a very fiscally constrained environment, and an unprecedented environment in terms of public finances. The other another data point that I found quite interesting, and these data points are actually quite old now. They came from the middle of the year, but there's a sense of we don't actually have, maybe we haven't even felt the true impacts yet economically. These data points come from the ATO, and they compare the amount of businesses which went bankrupt last year compared to this year. And so you can see sort of almost counterintuitively, there's far less businesses going out of business this year than last year because of the public subsidies. So there's a sense of not only are we yet to experience the impacts of COVID directly, but perhaps the public investment has hidden a lot of economic or change in the business sector, which would have happened more naturally. And so again, looking ahead to what lies beyond the cliff in terms of the business sector and the economy. The next point I'd kind of make is that this was a health crisis, which became an economic crisis, which is becoming a social crisis. So it's really revealed the interconnected nature of these external shocks, and that we can't silo different parts of the economy from each other. And I think in terms of regional development, actually in regional places, there's actually a far greater sensitivity to the interconnections between community, economy and environment. But often we have siloed these areas, and an external shock like that, it makes us really realize about our independencies. The next touch point I'd say is that the impacts of COVID are also unequal. So one of the things that we learned from the Brisbane floods back in 2011 was that after a year, those that had been doing well before were doing well again. But those that were doing not so well before actually saw the increased negative impacts. So this isn't just a case of a recovery, sort of as a whole. Again, there's this idea of very asymmetric impacts and how those that were already disadvantaged may feel, sort of that pressure increased. And what we're starting to see of all the different letter shape possible recoveries, one of the ones that's starting to come out now is this idea of a K-shaped recovery, where on one hand, those that were doing well, will bounce back. And you can almost see that, in terms of how well the share market's doing compared to perhaps the real economy. But those that were in the more vulnerable brackets are the areas which are going to feel pain points. And those vulnerabilities can be seen across gender, race, age, and geography. This is maybe getting into the weeds a little bit, but I think this idea of inequality does loom large as the bigger systemic risk. This is global wealth and how it's allocated, amongst populations. And we were already seeing vast inequalities in terms of who owns what around the world. So the fact that an external shock on a global scale is likely to amplify those inequalities leads into other systemic impacts, particularly around political and social risk. So COVID has been a systemic challenge, and of course, it's not the only one we face. And so off the back of COVID, we're looking to an unpredictable economic environment. Of course, before COVID, there were the bushfires, other implications around climate change, and indeed beyond that, negative impacts on the basic ecosystems and biodiversity, which actually give us a benign environment to build societies and economies within. So there's a lot of other systemic challenges coming down the pathway to us beyond COVID. Just a couple more points about taking stock. This kind of scraggly diagram, and I'll share the slides afterwards, but what this is really kind of saying is, like, regardless of the letter shape of recovery, that recovery is actually just going to exist in a fundamentally different trajectory. So beyond the rate of how we get back up and running, the sectors and the businesses and the ways that we grow our economies is going to shift. So there is going to be a big change outside of the concept of just getting back to where we were. And of course, a big driver of this is the ongoing pace of technology, which brings us so much opportunity and has created significant value across society. And technology is exponentially changing, and that exponential change just got accelerated as a result of COVID. So whether that's the size of technology companies, and Apple reaching a market cap of more than 2 trillion, which is consistently higher than most countries' GDP, but also the emergence of AI, quantum computing. And it's hard to know where these are going to end up. And we speak a lot around the impact of automation in the economy. But I think it goes beyond that. The whole ways that we organize, not just in terms of employment, but in terms of how we structure public sector, private sector, community sector, this will change. And so we're sort of currently in a legacy environment, and we don't quite know where the new opportunities and challenges are going to take us. So to surmise, and I think everyone's got a sense of this, COVID has kind of been a microcosm. It's been a big deal, but it's been a microcosm of the significant change that we're experiencing more broadly across society and economy. And the environment that we are building our economies in now are sort of characterized by these ideas of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. But that's not a negative picture alone. To me, that also says, well, change is inevitable. So what is the change that we actually want to impose on the design of our markets and economy? And how do we actually start moving towards preferable futures rather than being reactive to either the past or circumstance? So that brings, what might that next economy look like? What might better look like? And at the heart of this, I would say there's this idea, in the same way these external shocks do not differentiate between economy, society, community, and culture, our responses actually have to become far more integrated as well. So we have to better understand value flows in between the economy, society, and the environment. And that's becoming increasingly well expressed by things like the Sustainable Development Goals, which effectively give us a broader range of outcomes for what a good economy and society looks like. And so the business models which work within that, and the way that we think about innovation and economic development within that, I think it's going to be shifting towards a far more holistic sense of value. That obviously has a lot of benefit for the economy serving other outcomes like environment and society, especially as we're moving into a fiscally constrained world. So we're becoming quite familiar with terms like circular economy, which are thinking about getting more value out of natural resources. But if we layer on top of that social impact and cultural impact, then we move towards this holistic idea of a regenerative economy. And that's what the three stories that I'm just going to explore kind of focus on. So the first story, better businesses. One of the, Kate mentioned I'm on the board of B-Lab, which is the certifying organisation of B Corps. But B Corps are for-profit businesses who are adopting to who are choosing to adopt a higher level of performance standards across their business. So in addition to financial return, they are measuring their performance around governance, how they treat their employees, how they relate with community, their environmental footprint, and also the impact that they have on customers. An example of a B Corp, which is in Mount Tamborine in southeast Queensland, OUTLAND Denim. So a boutique garment manufacturer, but they, in addition to making a very successful product and taking paying considerable attention to their supply chain in terms of environmental impact, they're also using their business model to provide high quality employment to women who have had lived experience of sex trafficking. So they're using their business model as a regenerative place for people who have been abused and disadvantaged. And they're also using their voice to amplify the importance of better practices across the garment industry as a whole. So you have a business that's doing very is being very successful in its own right, but it's creating all these additional value points across the community, environment, and society. Another example of businesses which are thinking in this regenerative way, and this was a collective approach by social enterprises in Victoria during the pandemic. Moving Feast was a number of food-based social enterprises which organised not just the value chain, but a value system to make sure that people who were vulnerable during lockdown got access to healthy food on a consistent basis. So they mobilized as a COVID response. But what's interesting now is they've developed this value system, which actually has a lot of commercial capability as well. So be it the growers, the logistics, the processors, the retail outfits, Moving Feast is now sort of a really interesting business system rather than just an individual business. And again, focused on creating multiple forms of value. I think this isn't just about push either, it's about pull. And going back to the Sustainable Development Goals, it would seem that a lot of the future economic activities, the economic activities that we need to shift towards, are actually going to be aligned with the SDGs. So a lot of the areas which provide really good opportunities for innovation and value creation are actually aligned with these broader positive impacts around environment and society. So there's going to be potentially a natural shift into these blended value spaces. The second story I wanted to say was around better institutions. And what I mean by institutions, particularly is anchor institutions, universities, hospitals, local councils, golf clubs, museums, but organisations which are very much rooted in place, which have more ability to create community wealth, particularly in their localities. So a really good story of anchor institutions working together to drive local economic development comes from Cleveland, Ohio, where a number of anchor institutions have been organising for the last 15 years to address economic decline. So through their procurement spend, through use of their physical premises, through leverage of their balance sheets, they've generated significant drivers for local economic development. And currently these 19 institutions or so direct about $1 billion US dollars of local spend a year into the direct locality and region. They created any number of new businesses within Cleveland and created new jobs, future-oriented jobs as a result. And they've also leveraged their balance sheet to unlock private investment, which has gone into public infrastructure such as affordable housing. One of the examples of the businesses which has come out as a result of this kind of anchor institution strategy has been Evergreen Co-ops, which have businesses in horticulture, renewable energy, and other areas. And here, it's not just a case of creating jobs where there's been long-term economic decline. It's creating ownership or a stake in the ownership of the company as well through the cooperative model. So that's a really interesting approach to give people a stake in an asset as well as a paycheck. And one of the things that we've been looking at the Yunus Centre at Griffith is what is the opportunity to unlock more value from public institutions? So getting beyond the narrow mission of a university doing research and teaching, how do we use our balance sheet? How do we use our procurement? How do we use our spaces to create other forms of community wealth? And particularly in a regional context, a lot of the time, anchor institutions are going to be real key players in local economies. So while we often think about bright and shiny things in terms of innovation, actually what's the innovation around the existing infrastructure that we have, and how can that enable other forms of innovation as a result? The last story I'm going to look at is better civic innovation. And I'll start here just by these data points come from the Endelman Trust Barometer. It comes out every year, and the Endelman Trust Barometer is just a really interesting document. It's the biggest global market research on consumer and citizen sentiment. These data points are from the Australian data set, although they align quite consistently with other areas in the world. And this is pre-COVID, and it'll be interesting to see where it's moved since. But where do citizens actually, who do they trust? Where do they think leadership is going to come from? And we've seen this decline in trust from traditional institutions, be it the private or public sector, or indeed religious establishments over the last decade or so. And actually, where people are optimistic and where they do have trust is with each other and within their local communities. And I think trust is actually a really important ingredient of innovation, because when you have strong social ties, you have the possibility for more new ideas and the emergence of new activities to come forth. So this element of building trust in community and between citizens potentially is another lever that we can draw on to create new forms of value. Some really interesting stuff that's going on around civic innovation, and this example is from London in the UK, but these neighbourhood innovation programs are actually cropping up all around the world. And what defines them, which is quite different from just a community get together once a month in a village hall, is they're very intentionally design-led by local people for local people. They have a saturation of activity within a concentrated space. So be that sort of maker spaces or business incubators or repair shops or urban agriculture. But making things which are useful and accessible to all people in that place to build connections and create new forms of value. And lastly, they're technology backed. So be that around the visibility or the connectivity between people, but also starting to build data commons, which themselves could have commercial value. So this project, which has been going for a couple of years in Dagenham in London, just to give you a sense, this is quite a concentrated borough, but they've got 150 civic innovation projects up and running within this concentrated space in a couple of years, and it seems to be making a really interesting impact on the whole nature of that community. An example closer to home, this is a startup, it's a platform cooperative which has come out of Bendigo, Beehive, and what they are trying to do is use technology to create social capital within the community, but then also create a marketplace where people within that local place can actually better trade with each other. So this whole idea of the sharing economy, Uber Eats or what have you, there's a lot of leakage which goes offshore. How can we actually repurpose technology to actually make that value circulate in local economies, more intensively, and as a result, create, micro enterprise opportunities, sole trader opportunities, community business opportunities, and indeed more conventional business opportunities as well. So where I'll finish this section is social capital sometimes seems a little bit of a woolly idea, particularly when it's connected to economic development. But I think we do recognize that where there are strong community bonds, where there is social capital, that enables resilience, particularly in terms of responding to external shocks. And it also is a platform which enables innovation to happen. So when we think about sort of innovation policy or economic development approaches, I think it's worthwhile thinking about these other drivers of successful economic outcomes, which actually might be around the resilience and connectivity and indeed the health of individuals in any given place or sector. So there are a few stories for better. How might we get there? And this is the final section before we maybe open up to some discussion. I think one of the challenges one of the opportunities and challenges around crises is it drive innovation. So we have seen a huge amount of innovation over the course of this year, at local level, regional, state, national, international level. Because crisis has a bias towards action, we have to see things differently. We develop a degree of common purpose. So it's a real driver to do things differently. But the challenge comes, how do we sustain that beyond the initial response phase? And going back to this idea, particularly when we are talking about this very volatile environment that we're building from, and also recognize that we are building into these shifted spaces. So it's not just a case of building back the house as it was. We're we're really going to be needing to build new houses with new architecture and new materials. So we can't just rely on memory. We actually have to find different ways of stimulating and carrying out innovation for the long term. So one of the first ideas that we've been looking at is it's the mindset piece. So rather than the sort of mantra around build back better, we've been talking about learning to better and recognizing if we are to get good outcomes, we actually have to be honest and say that we don't know how this is going to work. The situation is uncertain and volatile, and we actually have to up our game in terms of actually how we experiment and learn our way into new approaches. That requires having new skill sets. New mindsets require new skill sets. And so one of the things that we're really interested in is how do we democratize entrepreneurship? You know, entrepreneurship isn't just seen as a skill set of a small group of innovators, but it's actually seen as a skill set that everyone should have, every organization should have to some degree. Of course, there will always be, you know, individuals who are more effective in this area than others. But as a whole, just in the way that we once thought that literacy and numeracy were good things to have, we need to build this entrepreneurial capacity across our communities and organizations, public, private sector, community sector as well. The third point is how we organize ourselves. So this idea is around mission-led approaches. So mission-led approaches are really about going back to this idea of if we're facing complex challenges, you know, having linear ways of planning will not be appropriate because they cannot keep up with the range of variables and the complexity in the system. So one way of actually approaching complexity is that being clear about the goal that we want to achieve, but then thinking not in a planning way, but what are the things that we need to get right to enable transition towards that goal? Then who are the stakeholders, the stakeholders who contribute to that? And this is all about cross-sector engagement. And then beyond that, what are the bottom-up innovations, be them community, private sector, or public sector, which might contribute to those missions? So this is a kind of different way of framing how we might structure economic development or innovation strategies within place. And it really embraces the complexity rather than denies it. An example of how mission-led approaches, again, these are quite common and they're being used in many places, but the city of Manchester has used a mission approach to reduce its carbon zero by, 2032, I think. So recognizing that place as a container can be a really powerful way to think about all the things that city needs to do, from transport to agriculture to energy uses to new innovations. But how do you create a sort of framework which holds those things together whilst also allowing a lot of bottom-up innovation and experimentation? And just as a bit of a sidebar, earlier on in the pandemic, we released a framework for mission-led approaches in terms of a response to COVID, where we named a number of the missions that we thought that if were put into play, would likely to generate good holistic outcomes across economy, society, and environment. Just the last couple of points, I think, and this will be really relevant to SEGRA. I think in this sort of new way of thinking about innovation and economy, the renaissance of place and the value of place as a container to create holistic economic systems. And I think it's because systems become tangible in place. You can see how jobs connect to the environment, that connect with housing, which connect with the role of the local council and the university and the local entrepreneurs. So these things, which can seem quite abstract when we talk about them, theoretically, become really real in place. And that creates a really interesting way to think about combining, the SDGs, but at a very local level. I think also in place, people stick around. There are strong interconnections, there's social capital already. And that enables us to think about all the different levers that can be brought to bear. And of course, from an investment point of view, we can also see where spillovers exist as well. So some things which, if it's a standalone investment, might not look particularly sensible, you know, if we can see that maybe, you know, sort of making a sort of a less profitable investment in one area creates a whole heap of value in other areas, you know, we can get to see some of those positive spillovers. And last of all, in place, people have skin in the game, and that's true for people that work in the local council as it is that people work in local businesses. So you kind of get that sort of greater degree of in it together and agency to actually create something for the people within that place. It aligns incentives. And one of the interesting things we are seeing is the emergence of, you know, a bit like the civic innovation projects, you know, these place-based containers to think about these holistic economic plays. So I recently come from New Zealand. The Waikato Wellbeing Project is one of those. I saw a tweet the other day that the city of Dunedin, South Island, is using Kate Raworth's donor economics, which is kind of based on the SDGs, as a framework for this holistic economic planning. The last point I would make is around innovation infrastructure, in so much as if we are serious about doing things differently and see innovation as a primary mechanism of getting to better, of getting sustainable economies for the long term, we have to invest in the infrastructure, and that goes beyond tech accelerators in cities. We have to think really broadly about how all levels and in all geographies, we think about what are the conditions which are more likely to enable new things to be tested, take shape and grow, be that from the financing infrastructure, be it from the policy environment, be it around the spaces and places, be it around the capability, be it around the development opportunities of individual ventures. But we have to really think about the infrastructure for innovation rather than just sort of see entrepreneurs as some kind of slightly magical species which will kind of, you know, do their thing regardless. We have to plan for innovation. There's a thinker in the UK called Indy Johar, and he kind of says, look, you know, we spend about as much on innovation as we do on ice cream. And if we're really serious about taking this work forward and developing new pathways, we've got to get beyond the ice cream economy. So to wrap up, in terms of getting to better, what matters most? I think the first thing is it's like innovation is our tool to get to better, but the direction of innovation has to have a broader range of value creation. We have to think holistically and see the environment, economy, you know, and social impacts not as trade-offs, but things which are actually complementary to each other. We need a breadth of innovation on all levels, across all systems and all sectors and all geographies. We have to think about participation in innovation, be that institutions who will say we're not realizing the full value of, but also all the people which are otherwise excluded from being creative. We need to harness the full capacity of society. There's latent value there, and in fiscally constrained time, we need to get more value out of what we have. And last of all, the idea there has to be more equal participation in the benefits of wealth creation. You know, this inequality is creating, regardless of what you think about it from a point of view of values, it's creating political and social risk. And if we want to avoid entrenched disadvantage, we really have to think about how we enable more people to participate in wealth creation rather than just redistribute what we have through the tax system. And the last point I would go back to, one of the earlier points, is that this is a choice. This is about agency. There are a lot of challenges, but the societies and the economies we create in the next phase of this century do come down to the intentional choices that we make. So with that, I will leave it there and hand back to you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Alex. I certainly enjoyed that. I enjoyed your presentation in Mackay, and I found it very interesting what you had to say today. I'm encourage people to put in questions or comments or go to the chat box, and Alex can read those questions or comments as they come in. But I suppose one of the things that I'm really conscious of and became more aware of in your presentation today is that regional Australia is already in the lower income areas. There is already disadvantage in regional Australia, and so I'm really conscious of that. I'm also conscious of the technology gaps in regional Australia, and so I think at the moment I'm doing some work down in Balranald in southwest New South Wales, and probably 90% of the people that I've phoned to get them to participate in the survey don't have access to internet or don't use the internet, even if they have access to it. So I suppose for me, this is where I found some of your comments at the in terms of case studies quite interesting, because clearly one of the things that's happening here in the way that you're presenting this is a strong reliance on social capital. And you know, there are a range of elements of social capital. It's one of the things that I think regional Australia can do really well. I think though, and I'd like your comments around this, is the extent to which it's values driven and how you tap into understanding the values, because values, the shared values, I suppose, you use the word mission-led, and I think that that's probably quite a specific approach to shared values. And the other thing, I suppose, is that do you think that our processes, and I know the Yunus Centre is working in this space, do you think our institutional processes and our current traditional engagement processes really encourage that curiosity, creativity and innovation?
So there's a lot there, Kate. So I'll address the things which kind of were clicking through my mind as we spoke. I think there is this kind of juxtaposition between, you know, sort of a lot of rural and remote communities where a lot of the time you do, not always, but you do have higher degrees of connectivity and social capital because there's a degree of self-reliance. But then you have you know, generally underserved in terms of technology, both access to, but also capability to utilize as well. So I think the thing is there is like, you know, that digital divide is real. And you see it in organizations, you know, the organizations which have the resources and the capability technology are getting increasing efficiency gains. Those that don't are, you know, relatively are being left behind. So technology is another real point of inequality. And I think very consciously we have to think about sort of addressing that digital divide. I think the other things, the way that we think, so the relationship between I suppose the invitation to participate and then that being an enabler of agency. And you know, like from that project that I spoke about, Everyone Every Day, they talk about these gateway outcomes, that the first, before, there's almost a precondition before you get to innovation, and that's around connecting people and making people feel welcome, you know, and empowered that they actually, you know, have a voice and are enabled to actually do things. So before you get people being more creative, there is this sense of like you've got to sort of build. And look, this sounds quite woo-woo, I think, in a community context, but if you put it into an organizational context, you know, all corporates will talk, whether they do it or not is a different thing, but we'll talk about the importance of an enabling culture. And I think in terms of, you know, places as organisms, you know, communities, economies, we have to think about it the same way. It's just like, what are the conditions which enable people to get to a place where they can start to realize their potential? That is about some of that social and psychological, mental health, feeling safe, feeling connected, being empowered to experiment. And then some of it's more like, well, what's actually the infrastructure environment? And we've become very used in the 21st century to think about things like, you know, distributed models. be that energy going from centralized systems to, and I think the same goes to sort of policy and resourcing, so like, and I wonder, and to agree this is happening, but it's also not happening enough, where the government, starts to realize that its role in actually sort of, providing public value is actually going to be increasingly better done by enabling communities and people to have a greater say in doing that for themselves. So not just providing services, but actually seeing communities and individuals as producers of public value. So I think there's a sense of like, how do you get leaders in place which can create the containers for, sort of good connections and good things to happen? How do you build the infrastructure to support the emergence of those new things, be them businesses, projects, or what have you? And then how do we start to reinterpret the role of the role of government as an enabler of kind of more locally led innovation, be that again through business or for community, rather than just the provider of services? Because we know that there's no way that government can keep up with the rising demand for services. So at some point there has to be a more radical rethink about like, how is actually best to do this. And I think through all this, it's like, this isn't like pie in the sky. It's not to say that it always works, but there's enough data points to show that there are different approaches which are actually working incredibly well. But how do we take those from the margins and actually enable more community places, any other kind of group, that how we want to frame it, to actually take advantage of that learning and those innovations?
Thanks for that, Alex. And certainly one of the things in the project I'm working on at the moment is trying to tackle some of that enabler issue and capacity issues. And so we have sort of a local steering group and then a skilled advisory group. And that certainly, some of that model ideas come from experiences in Mildura, where they set up a community engagement framework governance group, so that there was a group that was specifically looking at the different sorts of value aspects that you were trying to generate. So social, economic and environmental being considered all together. But we've got a lovely comment in the chat box, which I just wanted to share with everyone, which is lots to think about, feedback for you, lots to think about, amazing stuff. And I think that reflects lots of people's response to your presentation. But he then goes on to say, my council has just completed both the overarching community plan and a 10-year economic development strategy. We need to run a number of rulers over what we have done. I think that that's an excellent comment, is that not to look at just the standard measures. The next comment is from Rod. Hi, Rod. Rod's actually a member of the SEGRA National Steering Committee. He's saying, Alex, could we have a brief discussion on your experience with how an individual has been able to initiate the adoption of innovation and change, the challenges they met, but also successes that they were able to achieve?
Yeah, I saw that from Rod. I think it's really interesting to see the relationship between individual leadership and collective leadership. So a lot of this is thinking about like, community or economy, so it's thinking about us as sort of larger groupings, but quite often the role of individual leadership in that is really material. So just going back to that moving feast example, look, there was probably many people within that, but from my understanding, Beck Scott, who was an entrepreneur who had set up Street, which is a social enterprise which provided employment to people who are either homeless or at risk of homelessness in Melbourne. It was a result of her working across the food system for many years, which then enabled her, when that COVID crisis moment came, to pull things together. So she had the sort of knowledge of the system and the convening power within the system to make that kind of, that thing work. So I think in, going back to Rob's point, is like the role of leadership in place is really, really important. And some people gravitate to those roles quite naturally. I think, back to the Waikato project, it wasn't an entrepreneur who pulled that together. It was someone that was working for one of the local energy foundations, but again, was entrepreneurial in the way that she, went about her work, but was coming from a very different part of the, the local economy. She was working in the philanthropic sector. So I think that leadership can come from different sectoral paces, but I think we also have to think about how do we actually, again, not rely on the magical stuff? How do we actually start to build these capabilities at an earlier stage? So you're not just waiting for the crisis to see who puts their head above water, and we can actually do it in a more proactive way. So I really do think the role of leadership, the development of leadership, and ideas about, like, even things like, the community facilitator role, the community organizer role. I mean, Barack Obama, that was his job well before he got into politics, So, I mean, thinking about how, if we want these things to happen, again, it's part of the infrastructure. How do we make sure it's maybe some people's jobs to actually do that convening role rather than just relying on, sort of goodwill and they expect those things to come out. Just going back to the other comment around the 10-year strategy, I kind of wonder, sort of where that started, and whether there's part of that was a kind of visioning process around what outcomes, what does success look at the end of 10 years, and the degree that the community were involved in articulating those outcomes. Because Kate, you mentioned the mission-led approach. The mission-led approach, I mean, is kind of a specific thing, but it's the whole idea of transition, as in, like, this is what good looks like, this is what better looks like. Let's actually name that, and then work back and think, what are the things which have to change or evolve in order for those outcomes to be met? And so that's where the missions come. It's just like, this needs to transition. We have to get this right. And once you name that, then, as I say, it does facilitate this bottom-up innovation to go, well, we know we do different things, but we're kind of starting to pull in the same direction. And I think a lot of the time it's starting to think about these, not strategies as linear approaches of action plans. It's more of a case of it's creating an orientation for multiple stakeholders to innovate towards. And managing that is messy, but that's the reality of the world. The world's messy, and that's why, again, we need these leaders and different types of, convening and organising to actually sort of be recognised and professionalised to a certain degree.
Thanks, Alex. And I think one of the skill sets that we're looking for in our future leaders is the capacity to be comfortable with ambiguity and change and uncertainty. There was a sense, and this is a few years ago now, that evidence-based policy was going to be the answers, but now people are realising that not all evidence is created equal, and so that there is much more ambiguity and fluidity in these things. And I certainly liked your diagram where you had the linear and then the cone and then finally that strategic networking. And I think there's been a shift in our understanding of what we're looking for in leaders. So I think, that there was a sense at one stage that leaders were out the front saying, come on, and setting the vision themselves, etc. But I think just some research from Comarves and Dugan in the mid 2010s, 2015, that sort of time, that they identified just 6 elements for place-based leaders' capacity. One was develop pathways for collective action. Second was a capacity to support for participants to broaden their capabilities to understand complexity. So not getting people focusing on getting people all on the one page, but recognising that there were different viewpoints within that. The capacity to clarify vision, construct mental models of how things might be, which I think certainly matches your point about thinking about what better is and then working backwards. I think that that's a really great take-home message, enhancing collective learning and recognising that there are very complex networks and perhaps not falling into the trap of oversimplifying it, but being happy to live with some of that ambiguity.
And look, and I think practically speaking, I mean, so a lot of the practice around, startup businesses now is kind of the lean startup model, right? And basically what that means is you don't really know what's going to happen, so you test stuff quickly and cheaply. And I think in terms of, again, that sort of abstract thing about what does dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty actually mean? Well, it means just basically saying not being freaked out by it or trying to create a reality, plan towards a reality which isn't likely to happen. And it's like saying, well, if we want to achieve these things, why don't we actually run a number of experiments? And the whole idea of learning is just like, well, are they working or not? How do we know whether this is working quickly and cheaply? And it applies whether you're starting up a business, whether you're running a community program, or whether you're developing a policy. And again, this is coming back to that kind of entrepreneurial mindset. It's not just about creating big, shiny tech products. It's basically having an experimental mindset, because we know we don't know the answers. So therefore, what's a practical way of working? And I think going back to the idea of a 10-year strategy, it's just like, well, if you can define what success, the aspirational goals are in 10 years, and then the things that have to move in order to get towards that, then you just start running experiments to try and, actually sort of get those things to move. And that's why I think, that highly pragmatic experimentation approach, good containers for how you connect people and enable people to learn from things, and then the infrastructure, the resourcing infrastructure to back the things that look like they have promise. So I think one of the jobs on this is moving away from the language of complexity and all that stuff, and going, well, what does that mean to people who are working day by day and actually want to see stuff happen? And I don't actually think it's as difficult as it might feel like. Some of it is quite common sense based, but it does require different ways of working, particularly from big institutions and the public sector. And that's a cultural challenge as much as anything else.
Look, I just want to close our conversation today, as always, we've run out of time, by reflecting the chat comment. It's been amazing stuff, Alex, and thank you very, very much for your time and the preparation you've put into it. Just to flag that Alex and I are having discussions about the possibilities of Alex getting across to Kalgoorlie Boulder. So if this has whet your appetite, hopefully we'll have a chance to unpick Alex's brain a little bit further in a conference format where we can actually have a conversation. But if I could just close by thanking you very much for your time, and to say again that it will of course be available on our website and on the SEGRA YouTube. Finally, next week we'll be welcoming Penny Stringer, the Industry Engagement Coordinator from UTAS Career Connect. Now, the University of Tasmania has a range of in-discipline and co-curricular work experience programs, including their flagship iPrep program. And this is designed specifically to be making links between potential graduates or future graduates and employers all over Tasmania. So trying to really target those areas that have big skills deficits in particular areas, and to be challenging people to engage with that process from the very start of their careers. So very much looking forward to hearing from Penny and the successes that they've had with that program in Tasmania. So again, thank you very much, Alex, for that, and we look forward to revisiting the video. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Kate, and goodbye, everyone. Good luck with your work, and hopefully have a restful summer.